I just wanted my bed sheets to smell like actual sunshine. Is that a crime? Apparently, in the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association of Aurora, Colorado, air drying a damp pair of boxer briefs is the equivalent of high treason. I didn't know this at the time, of course. I was just a guy, standing in his own backyard on a perfectly breezy Tuesday afternoon, trying to save a few bucks on the electric bill and enjoy the crisp mountain air. I had just bought this cheap, flimsy little $15 clothesline from the hardware store down the street. It was nothing special, just 2 aluminum poles and some nylon string. I hammered them into the perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass, which, by the way, the HOA legally mandates must be kept at exactly 2.5 inches, not a millimeter higher, and strung up my fitted sheet. Did I think hanging up a damp sheet would incite a neighbor? But I clearly underestimated the sheer, unadulterated boredom of a suburban HOA president with a power complex. I had barely clipped the second clothespin onto the fabric when I heard it. The unmistakable, rhythmic click-clack of sensible orthopedic heels striking the pavement, followed by the sharp snap of a gate latch. I didn't even have to turn around. I knew who it was. It was Brenda. Brenda was the HOA president of Whispering Pines. She had one of those sharp, asymmetrical haircuts that spoke directly to shift managers at retail stores, and a clipboard permanently glued to her left hand. I'm pretty sure she slept with it. She also wore these oversized, polarized sunglasses that made her look like a giant, judgmental insect. "Excuse me," a voice squawked from behind me, sharp enough to cut glass. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned slowly, holding a damp pillowcase. "Hey, Brenda, I'm doing laundry. Dry. It's a whole scientific process." Brenda did not find me funny. She marched right up to my property line, her eyes darting frantically between my laundry and her clipboard, as if my Egyptian cotton was emitting toxic radiation. "This is a direct violation of HOA Bylaw 4B, Section 2, she barked, tapping a manicured fingernail against the paper. "No unsightly outdoor hangings, tarps, or temporary structures are permitted on the exterior of any property." "It's a towel, Brenda," I sighed, gesturing to the offending fabric. "It's wet. I'm not building a shantytown. I'm just drying it." "It's an eyesore, Dave," she countered, her voice rising an octave, completely ignoring the fact that my name isn't even Dave. "We have property values to maintain. Do you want this neighborhood to look like a tenement? Take it down immediately, or face a $50—" I literally could not comprehend the level of hostility radiating from this woman over a standard household chore. I looked at the sheet gently swaying in the breeze. I looked back at her rigid, furious posture. "Brenda, are you seriously going to fine me for using the wind?" "The bylaws are the bylaws," she sniffed, adjusting her sunglasses. "You have exactly 24 hours to remove this monstrosity before I issue the first citation." She spun on her sensible heels and marched away, leaving me standing there with a damp pillowcase and a bubbling sense of malicious irritation. $50 a day? For a clothesline? I wasn't going to take it down, obviously. If anything, her little power trip just guaranteed that I was going to wash every single piece of fabric I owned. The next morning, I walked out my front door to grab the mail. And there it was, slapped right in the center of my freshly painted mahogany, a laminated pink warning slip. First notice of violation. Offense: unauthorized outdoor fixture, fine to be assessed in 24 hours. War had officially been declared. I went back inside, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and cracked open my laptop. If Brenda wanted to play the bureaucratic red tape game, she was messing with the wrong guy. I didn't just read rules. I broke them down, found the weak spots, and drove a legal bulldozer straight through them. That's the whole point of what I do. You want to use a rule book against me? Fine. Let's see what the actual law says. I spent the next 3 hours deep in the digital trenches of Colorado state housing regulations, municipal zoning codes, and property law. I bypassed the HOA bylaws entirely because, let's be real, HOAs think they operate above the law, but they don't. State law always supersedes a power-hungry neighborhood committee. And then, I found it. Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 38 to 33. Point 3 to 106.7. I practically fell out of my chair. I read it once. I read it twice. I started cackling alone in my kitchen. The statute was part of a broader environmental push by the state, and it explicitly prohibited any homeowners association from banning or unreasonably restricting energy efficiency measures. And right there, buried in subsection B, it explicitly defined an energy efficiency measure as a clothesline or retractable clothesline. It was bulletproof. The state of Colorado legally protected my right to dry my underwear in the wind. Brenda's bylaw 4B was entirely unenforceable, illegal, and completely void. I didn't just leave my cheap clothesline up. I went back outside and hung up every single towel I owned. I hung up my winter coats. I hung up a pair of neon swim trunks I hadn't worn since a trip. I turned my backyard into a vibrant, swaying tapestry of spite. Then, I went inside and drafted an incredibly smug, highly formal letter. Dear Brenda and the Whispering Pines, HOA Board, in response to your notice of violation regarding my clothesline, I respectfully direct your attention to Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 38 to 33.3 to 106.7, which strictly prohibits the restriction of energy efficiency measures, explicitly including clotheslines. As state law supersedes HOA bylaws, your citation is legally void. I consider this matter closed. Have a sunshine-filled day. I printed it, walked over to her house, and taped it to her front door, right over her little decorative wreath. It took exactly 45 minutes for the situation to go from a civil dispute to a full-blown emergency. I was sitting in my living room, watching an old action movie. When I saw the red and blue flashing, I peeked through the blinds. An Aurora Police Department cruiser was parked squarely in front of my driveway. You have got to be kidding me. I opened the front door just as a very large, very serious-looking police officer was walking up my driveway, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. He looked like a guy who was prepared to break up a domestic dispute or wrestle a stray dog. "Afternoon, officer," I called out, leaning against the doorframe. He stopped and looked at me, a confused frown creasing his forehead. "Are you the homeowner?" "I am." "What seems to be the problem?" "Sir, we received a 911 call about a hostile act of defiance and a potential disturbance at this residence." The officer, his name tag read Ramirez, sounded genuinely bewildered. He glanced around my quiet, peaceful front yard. "Is everything all right here?" I started laughing. I couldn't help it. "Officer Ramirez," Ramirez sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders. He took his hand off his belt. "Yes, sir. She claimed you were violating neighborhood codes and acting aggressively." "I am aggressively drying my laundry," I told him, pointing a thumb toward the backyard. I cited a state statute proving she couldn't ban my clothesline. She called the cops. Ramirez blinked slowly. He looked at me, then looked toward Brenda's house next door, where I could literally see the blinds twitching as she peeked out. "Sir, you're telling me I was dispatched on a priority call? Over wet clothes?" "It's a fitted sheet, officer. But I admit folding it is a complete nightmare." Ramirez pinched the bridge of his nose. He let out a long, exhausted breath that carried the weight of every ridiculous call he had ever taken in his career. "Right. Okay. This is a civil matter. I'm going to go have a chat with your neighbor about the misuse of the 911. You too, officer. Try the fresh air. It's great." I watched from my porch as Officer Ramirez marched over to Brenda's door and proceeded to give her a very stern, very loud lecture on the legal definition of an emergency. It was glorious. I thought I had won. I thought it was over. But I forgot one crucial thing about people like Brenda. They never, ever concede. They just find a bigger stick. 3 days later, I got a certified letter in the mail. It wasn't a pink slip this time. It was a formal legal notice from the law firm representing the Whispering Pines HOA. Apparently, Brenda had thrown a fit and demanded the HOA lawyers find a way around my state statute. And unfortunately for me, lawyers are sneaky. The letter acknowledged my right to have a clothesline under state law. How the statute stated that while HOAs couldn't ban clotheslines, they were legally allowed to enforce reasonable aesthetic and dimensional restrictions regarding location and size. The HOA board, under Brenda's tyrannical guidance, had held an emergency closed-door meeting and passed a new, hyper-specific set of aesthetic rules designed entirely to ruin my life. The letter outlined 3 new mandates. All outdoor drying apparatuses must be fully retractable and stored out of sight when not in active use. No drying apparatus or hung clothing may be visible above the standard 6-foot wooden privacy fence line from the street. The apparatus must be structurally attached to the primary residence, not freestanding in the yard. They gave me 48 hours to remove my cheap hardware store clothesline or face a newly approved, totally legal fine of $100 a day for violating the aesthetic restrictions. I felt a slow, creeping smile spread across my face. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I would look at these ridiculous, hyper-specific engineering requirements and just give up, throw my clothes in the dryer, and surrender. Oh, Brenda, you want reasonable dimensions? You want it below the fence line? You want it attached to the house? I'll give you dimensions. I'll give you the most magnificent, structurally sound, maliciously compliant drying apparatus this side of the Mississippi. It was time to call a contractor. Finding a contractor in the greater Denver area who is willing to intentionally antagonize a homeowners association is a lot harder than you might think. I spent the entirety of my Thursday morning making phone calls, and let me tell you, the cowardice was palpable. Most of these guys, the minute they hear the letters HOA, they instantly start backpedaling. "Oh, sorry, man," or "Listen, buddy, I just build decks. I don't want a lien put on my truck." It was pathetic. I didn't just need a guy with a hammer and a circular saw. I needed an artist. I needed an architect of spite. I needed a tradesman whose hatred for suburban bureaucracy burned brighter than a halogen work light. And on the 7th phone call, I found him. His name was Mike. Mike's online business profile didn't have a slick logo or 5-star reviews from housewives praising his subway tile installations. It was literally just a low-resolution photo of a Ford F-250 and a bio that read, "I build things to code. I don't care about your neighbor's feelings, cash or check." I knew instantly he was the one. When Mike pulled into my driveway later that afternoon, the sheer aura of the man almost knocked me over. He stepped out of his truck smelling like sawdust, stale coffee, and he had arms entirely covered in faded traditional tattoos, a gray speckled beard that looked like it had survived a house fire, and a tool belt that hung off his waist like a gunslinger's holster. He walked up my driveway without so much as glancing at my house. He just stared at the perfectly manicured lawns of my neighbors with a look of profound, existential disgust. "You the guy with the laundry problem?" he grunted, his voice sounding like gravel churning in a cement mixer. "I am," I said, offering a hand. "I'm the guy. Thanks for coming out on such short notice." Mike didn't shake my hand. He just walked right past me, unhooking a heavy-duty yellow Stanley tape measure from his belt. "Show me the yard." I led him through the side gate and into the backyard. The cheap $15 clothesline that had started this entire war was still standing in the center of the grass. A tragic little monument to my... Mike stopped and stared at it for a long, silent moment. He took off his beat-up baseball cap and scratched his head. "This?" he asked, pointing a calloused finger at the flimsy aluminum poles. "This is what they brought the lawyers in for?" "That's the one," I said, handing him the 3-page certified letter from the HOA's legal team. "They say it's an aesthetic violation. They gave me 48 hours to take it down, or they start hitting me with a $100 daily fine." Mike snatched the letter from my hands. He didn't say a word as he read it. He just stood there in the middle of my grass, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. I watched his jaw clench. I watched a vein throb slightly on his temple, and then, slowly, a terrifying, beautiful grin spread across his face, revealing a slightly chipped front tooth. "Oh, these people," Mike whispered, almost to himself. "These absolute parasites." He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "How much laundry do you actually have, kid?" "Honestly," I shrugged. "Not that much, a few loads a week. But that's not really the point anymore, is it?" "Damn right it's not the point," Mike barked, slapping the letter against his leg. "The point is compliance. They want rules? We're going to give them rules. Let's break this down." He walked over to my patio table, cleared away a potted plant, and slammed the legal letter down flat. He pulled a thick carpenter's pencil from behind his ear and pointed it at the paper like a prosecuting attorney presenting a murder weapon. "Rule number 1, Mike said, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial growl. "They say it can't be freestanding in the yard. Has to be structurally attached to the primary residence. What does that mean to you?" "I don't know," I said, leaning over the table. "I bolt a hook into the siding. If we just drill a hook into your vinyl siding, they'll claim it's a hazard and try to cite you for exterior damage. No, we are going to sink heavy-duty, galvanized steel lag bolts directly into the load-bearing studs of your exterior wall. We're going to attach industrial-grade structural brackets. I'm talking brackets rated to hold a small car, kid. When I'm done, a Category 5 hurricane could rip this house off its foundation, and that clothesline bracket will still be floating in the sky. It will be the most attached thing in this entire zip code." I felt a rush of adrenaline. Yes, this is exactly what I wanted. "Okay," I said, matching his energy. "What about rule number 2? They mandate it can't be visible above the standard 6-foot wooden privacy fence line from the street." Mike turned around and looked at my fence. He walked over to it, slapped the tape measure. 5 feet, 11 3/4 inches, he announced, locking the tape measure. "That's our ceiling, not a fraction of an inch higher. We are going to build this entire apparatus at exactly 5 feet, 11 inches. Anyone walking on the sidewalk out front won't see a single thread of cotton, but—" He paused, pointing a finger toward Brenda's 2-story house directly next door. "If a certain nosy neighbor happens to be looking out her 2nd-story master bedroom window, she's going to have a front-row seat to the greatest show on earth. She's the HOA president," I whispered, feeling a surge of pure, unfiltered glee. "Her name is Brenda. This entire thing is because of her." Mike looked at Brenda's house. He looked at the pristine, untouched siding. He looked at the decorative floral wreath hanging on her back patio door. He practically snarled. "I hate Brenda," Mike declared, despite having never met. "Which brings us to rule number 3. He tapped the pencil against the legal letter again, leaving a heavy smudge of graphite under the text. "All outdoor drying apparatuses must be fully retractable and stored out of sight when not in active use." "This is the tricky part," I admitted, crossing my arms. "How do we make a massive structural clothesline retractable without making it look like a cheap umbrella?" "We don't," Mike said simply. "The rule says retractable. It doesn't say how it retracts. It doesn't say it has to be small. It just means the line itself has to be able to be pulled back and stored." He grabbed a scrap piece of lumber from the bed of his truck and started sketching violently with his pencil. "Look here," he said, drawing a series of interconnected dots. "We mount a primary steel winch system to the load bearer. Then, we sink 3 4x4 pressure-treated wooden posts into the far edge of your property line, right up against the fence, set in 40 pounds of concrete each. We mount heavy-duty, ball-bearing marine pulleys to those posts, and then—" He looked up at me, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. "We run a continuous loop of high-tension, stainless steel, vinyl-coated aircraft cable. We zigzag it back and forth across your entire yard, from the house to the posts, threading it through the pulleys. When you want to use it, you crank the winch, and the line feeds out like a massive industrial spider web. When you're done, you unclip the clothes, hit the release latch, and an automated spring-loaded spool sucks the entire line back into a custom-built, aesthetically pleasing cedar housing box attached to your wall. I literally couldn't speak. I was staring at the crude sketch on the piece of wood, trying to comprehend the Mike, I finally breathed. How much line are we talking about here? Based on the square footage of this yard? He did some quick mental math, chewing on his lower lip. If we do a 4-lane zigzag at a 5'11" elevation, we can comfortably fit 200 linear feet of drying space. 200 feet. 200 feet of high-tension cable. That was enough line to dry the uniforms of a small militia. It was enough line to hang every single garment I had ever owned since I was a toddler simultaneously. Did I need 200 feet of clothesline? No. Did I want it? Absolutely. Can we actually build this? I asked, my voice trembling with excitement. Is it legal? Kid, it's not just legal, Mike laughed, a booming, echoing sound that made a flock of birds scatter from a nearby oak tree. It's aggressively compliant. It follows their idiotic rules down to the microscopic level. It's attached to the house, and it's completely retractable. There is not a judge in the state of Colorado who would rule against this masterpiece. How much? I asked, not even caring what the number was. I would have taken out a second mortgage for this. For the materials, the concrete, the marine pulleys, the aircraft cable, and the sheer joy of watching an HOA president lose her mind? Mike spat in his palm and held it out. $800. I'll be back tomorrow at 6 a.m. Tell your neighbors to buy some earplugs. I shook his hand. It was rough, covered in calluses, and felt like victory. The next morning, the sun hadn't even fully crested over the Rocky Mountains, when the silence of whispering pines was violently shattered by the sound of a diesel engine and the hydraulic. I was standing on my front porch in my pajamas, holding a mug of coffee, watching in awe as Mike and 2 heavily tattooed guys who looked like they played bass in a metal band piled out of the F-250. They were hauling out equipment that looked completely out of place in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. Post-hole diggers, industrial hammer drills, massive bags of fast-setting quikrete, spools of gleaming silver aircraft cable that caught the early morning light like a weapon. "Morning, boss," Mike yelled over the rumble of the truck, tossing a pair of leather work gloves at my chest. "We got 48 hours before their little legal deadline, right? Well, we're gonna have this thing operational by noon." They didn't waste a single second. The crew moved into my backyard within 20 minutes. The tranquil morning air was utterly destroyed by the deafening roar of a gas-powered auger tearing into the Kentucky bluegrass. Dirt was flying everywhere. I watched from the patio, sipping my coffee, as they drilled 3 massive 3-foot-deep holes right along the back edge of my property line, inches from the fence. It didn't take long for the audience to arrive. I heard the frantic sliding of a glass patio door next door. I glanced over and saw Brenda standing on her back deck, wearing a pink terrycloth bathrobe, her hair wrapped in a towel. She looked like she had just been electrocuted. Her eyes were wide with panic as she stared at the sheer volume of construction happening 20 feet from her property line. "What is going on here?" she shrieked, her voice easily piercing through the roar of the machinery. "What are you doing to the yard?" I leaned over the railing, giving her a friendly, "Just doing some home improvements, upgrading the energy efficiency of the property." "You don't have approval for an exterior renovation," she screamed, abandoning her coffee mug on the railing and practically sprinting down her deck stairs. She marched right up to the shared fence, trying to peer over it. But since she was only about 5'4", she was forced to stand on her tiptoes, gripping the wooden planks with white knuckles. "Stop," she yelled at Mike's crew. "I am the president of this association. I demand you cease this unauthorized construction immediately." Mike didn't even look up. He was currently wrestling a massive 8-foot pressure-treated wooden post into the freshly dug hole. He leveled it, checked it with a bright yellow spirit level, and kicked a heavy bag of concrete toward one of his guys. "Hey, are you deaf?" Brenda yelled, now frantically waving her hands over the fence. "I am ordering a stop work." He wiped a smudge of dirt off his forehead with the back of his forearm. He turned around, walked over to the fence, and stopped exactly 2 inches away from where Brenda's fingers were gripping the wood. He stared down at her with eyes colder than a Colorado winter. "Ma'am," Mike rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. "Unless you got a badge from the Aurora building and zoning commission tucked inside that bathrobe, I suggest you step back from my active job site. We are pouring concrete, and if you distract my crew, I'll bill you for the ruined badge." "This is an unapproved structure," Brenda sputtered, her face turning a dangerous shade of magenta. "You are violating half a dozen bylaws. I'm calling the police." "Call the mayor for all I care," Mike shot back, leaning closer. "This isn't a permanent structure. It's not an outbuilding, and it doesn't require a municipal permit because it falls under the classification of we are strictly adhering to the revised aesthetic guidelines provided by your own legal counsel on Tuesday the 14th. Now, kindly remove your hands from the property line before I accidentally drop a hammer on them." Brenda actually gasped. She snatched her hands back as if the fence had caught fire. She looked at me, she looked at Mike, and then she turned and ran back into her house, presumably to call every authority figure she could think of. "I like her," Mike smirked, turning back to the post. "She's got spirit. Pour the concrete, boys. Let's lock these anchors in." For the next 4 hours, I watched a master class in petty engineering unfold. They mounted the heavy-duty steel brackets directly into the side of my house, securing them with bolts so thick they looked like they belonged on a suspension bridge. They bolted the marine-grade pulleys to the wooden posts, ensuring they spun with. They ran the high-tension vinyl-coated steel back and forth, from the house to the fence, back to the house, back to the fence. 4 massive, parallel lanes of drying potential. When Mike finally locked the end of the cable into the automated winch system attached to my wall, the entire apparatus hummed with latent energy. "All right," Mike said, wiping his hands on a rag. He walked over to the hand crank on the side of the housing box. Moment of truth. He gave the crank a swift turn. The marine pulleys shrieked, a high-pitched metallic squeal that echoed through the entire neighborhood. The 200 feet of cable instantly pulled taut, vibrating like a giant guitar string. It was perfectly level. It was immensely strong. And as I walked out into the middle of the yard and looked toward the street, it was completely, undeniably invisible from the other side. I whispered, staring up at the sprawling web of steel hanging exactly 5 feet and 11 inches off the ground. "It's beautiful." "It's a monstrosity," Mike corrected me proudly. "It is a hideous industrial eyesore, and it is 100% legally compliant. Now where's the laundry?" "Where's the laundry?" Mike asked, standing in the middle of my yard with his hands on his hips, admiring his terrifying steel creation. Honestly, that was the one flaw in my master plan. I stood there, looking at 200 feet of high-tension industrial aircraft cable, and realized a fundamental truth about myself. I am a single guy who works from home. I mean, literally, my entire wardrobe consists of maybe 10 black t-shirts, 3 pairs of jeans, some gym shorts, and a couple of button-downs for Zoom calls. If I washed every single textile in my house, including my bath mats and my oven mitts, I could maybe fill up 20 feet of that line. He saw the realization dawn on my face. "You don't have enough clothes, do you?" He sighed, shaking his head. "I guess I could wash my curtains," I offered weakly. Mike pulled a greasy rag out of his back pocket and wiped the concrete dust off his hands. "Kid, we didn't just build the Golden Gate Bridge of laundry for you to hang up 3 pairs of khakis and a dish towel. This is about sending a message. This is psychological warfare. We need volume. We need color. We need things that will physically assault the retinas of anyone looking out a second-story window." He pointed a thick, calloused finger at my chest. "You have exactly 3 hours before this concrete fully cures, and we can start hanging weight on the line. Get in your car, go to the thrift store, buy the most obnoxious, aggressively hideous fabrics you can find. I'm going to go get a 12-pack of Coors Banquet. I'll meet you back here. I grabbed my keys and spent the next 2 hours going on the most unhinged shopping spree of my entire life. I literally hit 3 different Goodwill locations in the greater Aurora area. I wasn't looking for clothes, I was looking for aesthetic weaponry. My first stop was the clearance rack at the Salvation Army down on Colfax. I walked in, grabbed one of those squeaky metal carts, and just started throwing things in. I didn't care about size, I didn't care about gender. I cared about visibility. I found a pair of genuine 1990s MC Hammer-style parachute pants in a shade of neon green that honestly looked like it was radioactive. In the cart, I found a collection of 7 different ugly Christmas sweaters. And I'm not talking about the cute, ironic ones you buy at Target. I'm talking about thick, itchy, hand-knitted atrocities featuring cross-eyed reindeer with 3D jingle bells. So at the second thrift store, I hit the jackpot in the lingerie section. I found 3 pairs of what I can only describe as Victorian-era bloomers. They were massive. They were white with giant, aggressive red polka dots. They looked like something a clown would wear under a hoop skirt. I bought all of them, but my pièce de résistance, the absolute crown jewel of my haul, came from a liquidation surplus store on the edge of town. I was walking down an aisle of discounted party supplies when I saw it, stuffed into a clear plastic bin on the bottom shelf. It was a 20-foot-tall, violently yellow, inflatable tube man. You know, the kind they hook up to industrial fans in front of used car dealerships to flail around in the wind? I dragged it up to the cash register. The cashier, a teenager with a nose ring who looked like he hadn't slept in a week, just stared at it. "You buying the whole tube, guy?" "Yep," I said, slapping a $20 bill on the counter. "Just out of curiosity, if I get this completely soaking wet, it still technically counts as laundry, right?" The kid looked at me blankly. "Man, I literally just work here." I loaded my trunk until it was overflowing with the most chaotic assortment of textiles in human history. When I pulled back into my driveway, Mike was sitting on my patio in a folding chair, cracking open his 3rd beer. He had greased the marine pulleys, and the entire steel rig was gleaming in the afternoon sun. "All right," Mike grinned, crushing his empty can. "Let's see the payload." I popped the trunk. Mike walked over, peered inside at the mountain of neon fabrics, ugly sweaters, and the deflated yellow corpse of the car dealership tube man. A single, manly tear of joy practically welled up in his eye. "It's beautiful," he whispered. We spent the next 30 minutes in the driveway with my garden hose. Remember, the law protected my right to dry things. If I just hung up dry clothes, they could nail me for storing junk in the yard. Every item had to be legitimately, undeniably wet. Then, the real work began. I stood at the cedar housing box attached to my house, manning the hand crank. Mike stood at the start of the line with a massive bucket of wooden clothespins. "Hit it!" Mike yelled. I gave the crank a turn. Squeak! The sound of the high-tension cable rolling through those heavy-duty marine pulleys was magnificent. It sounded like a dying pterodactyl. It was so loud, so piercing, that I saw a flock of pigeons take off from a roof 3 houses down. Mike grabbed the neon green parachute pants, slapped them onto the line, and pinned them. Squeak! I pulled the line forward. He hung up a red polka dot clown bloomer. Squeak! I pulled it again. Up went a Christmas sweater with a massive, glittery Santa face. Squeak! We got a turn. Squeak! Pin! We were an assembly line of pure, malicious compliance. Slowly, steadily, the 4 parallel lanes of steel cable began to fill up. From the street, looking over the pristine 6-foot wooden privacy fence, you couldn't see a thing. My yard looked completely normal. But from the inside, it looked like a traveling circus had exploded. We saved the tube man for last. It was so heavy when it was wet that we both had to hoist it up. We laid it out sideways across 2 different lanes of cable, pinning it every 3 inches so it stretched out horizontally like a massive, deflated yellow school bus hovering 5 feet and 11 inches off the grass. "Lock it down," Mike commanded, wiping sweat from his brow. I hit the locking latch on the winch. The line snapped taut, perfectly supporting the weight of 200 feet of wet, absurd laundry. We stepped back onto the patio, cracked open. The sheer density of the fabric completely blocked the view of the back fence. The wind picked up, rustling the parachute pants and making the bells on the ugly Christmas sweaters jingle softly. And then we heard it. It started as a sharp gasp, followed immediately by the sound of a plastic coffee tumbler hitting a wooden deck and shattering. We looked up. There she was, Brenda. She was standing on her second-story master bedroom balcony. Her view of the majestic Rocky Mountains, which she usually enjoyed every afternoon, was now completely, 100% obstructed by a 20-foot-long, violently yellow inflatable tube man and 3 pairs of giant polka-dot bloomers gently swaying in the Colorado breeze. Brenda's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. She just gripped the railing of her balcony. She looked like her brain was actively short-circuiting as it tried to process the visual assault happening strictly below the legal fence line. "You!" she finally shrieked. It was a sound that shattered the tranquility of the neighborhood. It was the screech of a harpy who had just realized her bylaws were powerless. "What is that? What have you done?" "Just doing some laundry, Brenda," I yelled back, raising my beer can in a friendly salute. "Got a lot of loads to catch up on." "That is not laundry," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the deflated tube man. "That is a car dealership balloon." "Hey," Mike hollered up at her, cupping his hands around his mouth. "The Colorado revised statutes do not discriminate on the origin or shape of the fabric, ma'am. He's practicing energy efficiency." "I am calling code enforcement," Brenda howled, spinning around so fast she almost tripped over her own sliding glass door track. She slammed the glass door so hard I genuinely thought the pane was going to shatter. Mike chuckled, taking a long pull of his beer. "Jail, huh? I guess they got a special cell block for excessive drying." We didn't have to wait long. Honestly, I think Brenda must have told the city dispatcher that I was building a nuclear reactor in my yard, because an official City of Aurora code enforcement truck pulled up to my curb less than 45 minutes later. A guy stepped out of the truck. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing a high-visibility yellow vest, a faded polo shirt, and an expression of utter, soul-crushing exhaustion. He held a metal clipboard, a real one, not a plastic HOA one, and a laser measuring tool. I walked out to the front gate to meet him. "Afternoon," I said politely. The inspector sighed. "Are you the homeowner?" "I am." "Look, I just got off the phone with a woman who screamed at me for 12 uninterrupted minutes. She claims you have built an illegal, unpermitted, structurally hazardous commercial structure in your backyard that is actively destroying her property value. I need to inspect the premises." "By all means," I smiled, pushing the side gate open. "Right this way." The inspector walked through the gate, his eyes glued to his clipboard. He stepped onto the grass, looked up, and stopped dead in his tracks. His pen slipped out of his hand and fell into the dirt. He stared at the neon parachute pants. He stared at the jingle bell sweaters. He stared at the massive yellow tube man strung up like a hunting trophy. He stood in absolute silence for a full 60 seconds. "What, in the name of God, is this?" he finally whispered. "It's a retractable clothesline, sir," Mike answered from his folding chair anchored to the load-bearing studs of the primary structure, fully compliant with state energy efficiency statutes. The inspector slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his laser measuring device. He walked over to the wooden privacy fence. He placed the base of the laser on the ground and shot the beam straight up to the very top edge of the aircraft cable. He looked at the digital readout. 5 feet, 11 inches, the inspector mumbled. "Exactly." Mike smiled. The inspector walked over to the cedar housing box attached to my siding. He examined the heavy-duty lag bolts. He examined the spring-loaded winch mechanism. He reached out and tugged hard on the steel cable. It didn't budge a millimeter. "It's structurally sound," the inspector noted, sounding almost offended by how well built it was. Built it myself, Mike said proudly. The inspector turned around and looked at me. His eyes held a mixture of deep annoyance. You know, your neighbor next door is literally having a nervous breakdown, right? She's claiming this is an aesthetic violation of her HOA bylaws. I am aware, I nodded. However, as per the HOA's own recently amended guidelines, which were drafted specifically to target me, the line only needs to be below the 6-foot fence limit, structurally attached to the house, and retractable. Which it is. I walked over to the crank, released the lock, and turned the handle exactly 1 rotation. Squeak! See? Retractable. I locked it again. The city inspector looked at the tube man one last time. He sighed, picked up his pen from the dirt, and scribbled something on his official municipal notepad. Is there a city ordinance against drying a 20-foot inflatable tube? I asked innocently. No, the inspector said, ripping the yellow carbon copy off his pad and handing it to me. There is no municipal ordinance governing the specific The structure does not require a permit, as it is not a permanent outbuilding. It is below the fence line, so it doesn't violate street view zoning. Have a nice day, sir. He turned around and walked back out the gate. Wait! We all looked up. Brenda was leaning frantically over her balcony railing, waving her phone. Did you cite him? Are you tearing it down? Tell them to tear it down! The inspector stopped at the edge of my driveway. He looked up at Brenda. He looked at his clipboard. Ma'am, the inspector yelled back, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. The homeowner's temporary drying apparatus is fully compliant with Aurora Municipal Code. This is a civil matter between you and the homeowner. Do not call my dispatch office again unless someone is building a shed without a permit. He got into his truck, started the engine, and drove away. I looked. The silence in the backyard was deafening, broken only by the soft, mocking jingle of the bells on the wet Christmas sweaters. She didn't scream this time. She didn't yell. She just turned around, walked slowly back into her bedroom, and closed the sliding glass door with a soft, defeated click. Well, Mike said, draining the last drop of his beer. I think that went rather well. I'm gonna head out, kid. Call me if you ever need a spite deck built. But of course, I knew it wasn't over. People like Brenda don't just surrender because a city inspector told them no. They regroup. They double down. They abuse their power in closed-door meetings. Sure enough, at exactly 8 a.m. the following Monday, I found a heavy, cream-colored envelope taped to my front door. It was sealed with actual red wax. I mean, literally, who uses wax seals anymore? I cracked it open. Urgent. Homeowner is hereby ordered to appear before the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Board of Directors at 7 p.m. tonight in the community clubhouse regarding repeated, malicious subversion of community bylaws and intentional infliction of aesthetic distress. I smiled. I walked into my backyard, unclipped a pair of perfectly dry, sun-crisped polka dot bloomers from the high-tension line, and started preparing my defense. It was time for the final showdown. I walked into the Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse at exactly 6:59 p.m. I mean, honestly, the place was exactly what you'd expect for a suburban HOA headquarters. It smelled like heavily chlorinated pool water, stale Folgers coffee, and low-level despair. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting this sickly yellow glow on the cheap, foldable tables they had set up at the front of the room. And there, sitting in the center chair like the Supreme Court, she had actually brought a gavel. Like a literal wooden gavel. I literally almost burst out laughing right there by the door. Sitting next to her were the other 2 board members. There was Gary, a retired accountant who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on planet Earth. And Helen, Brenda's loyal crony, who was glaring at me over the rim of her reading glasses like I had just tracked mud onto her white carpet. I casually strolled down the center aisle. I had specifically chosen my outfit for this exact moment. I was wearing one of the button-down shirts I had washed and hung on the great industrial spite line. It was perfectly crisp, slightly stiff from the sun, and smelled aggressively like mountain breeze fabric softener. "You're late," Brenda snapped, adjusting her oversized polarized glasses. "I'm actually a minute early," I said, pulling out a metal folding chair in the front row and scraping it loudly against the linoleum floor. I sat down, crossed my legs, and smiled. "But please don't let me interrupt the tribunal. Let's get this over with." Brenda picked up her little wooden gavel and gave the folding table a single, authoritative whack. "I call this emergency meeting of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association to order," she announced, her voice dripping with venom. "We are here to address the ongoing malicious subversion of community guidelines by the homeowner at Lot 42. Specifically, the intentional infliction of aesthetic distress and the construction of an unauthorized commercial-grade laundry apparatus." Gary sighed, resting his chin in his hand. "Brenda, we already called the city. The inspector said it was legal." "The city inspector is a fool," she hissed, shooting Gary a death. "We govern our own aesthetic standards, which is why I am introducing an emergency amendment to Bylaw 4B. She aggressively shuffled a stack of papers and cleared her throat loudly. "The proposed amendment," she read, her voice climbing higher with every word, "states that any permitted retractable drying line may only be used for the drying of traditional, standard-sized household garments. It explicitly bans the hanging of parachutes, oversized novelty items, inflatable automotive advertisements, and theatrical costumes. Furthermore, the volume of drying may not exceed 10 items at any given time." She lowered the paper and looked at me with a triumphant, smug little smirk. She really thought she had me. She thought she could just invent a new rule, pass it in a closed room, and force me to dismantle my 200-foot masterpiece. I didn't say anything at first. I just let the silence. I slowly uncrossed my legs, reached into my leather messenger bag, and pulled out a thick, heavily tabbed manila folder. I stood up. I walked right up to the foldable table, and I dropped the folder directly in front of her. Smack. "What is this?" Brenda sneered, leaning away from the folder like it was a live grenade. "That, Brenda, is 14 pages of printed legal precedent," I said, my voice completely calm, letting every syllable echo in the quiet room. "Specifically regarding Colorado right-to-dry cases and HOA overreach. I highlighted the important parts for you, but I know reading comprehension isn't really your strong suit, so I'll just summarize." "You don't have the floor," Helen squawked, clutching her pearls. "I am taking the floor," I snapped, locking eyes with Helen until she physically recoiled. I turned back to the board. "Your own lawyers told you last week that you cannot ban my clothesline," I began. "So, you gave me hyper-specific dimensional and aesthetic rules. You told me it had to be fully retractable. It is. You told me it had to be structurally attached to the house. It is, using industrial lag bolts. You told me it had to be absolutely invisible above the 6-foot fence line from the street. I hired a structural contractor to build it at exactly 5 feet, 11 inches. It's a spite structure," Brenda yelled, her face flushing bright red. "You're drying a car dealership balloon just to torture me." "I am drying a damp textile," I shot back, raising my voice just enough to dominate the room. "And I don't care if it's a balloon, a pair of jeans, or a parachute. The state statute regarding energy efficiency measures does not give you, Gary, Helen, or anyone else in this zip code, the authority to police the type of fabric I choose to air dry, nor the volume of it, so long as the apparatus meets the physical constraint." I leaned over the table, planting both my hands flat on the cheap plastic surface, bringing my face inches from Brenda's. "Now, let's talk about your little emergency amendment," I whispered, my voice dripping with pure malicious compliance. "If you try to pass a rule limiting the number of items I can dry, you are directly contradicting state energy policy. That is a direct violation of Colorado Revised Statutes, Section 38 to 33.3 to 106.7. And if you attempt to enforce that illegal rule with fines—" I paused, looking directly at Gary and Helen, who were now staring at me with wide, panicked eyes. "I will not just sue the HOA. I will pierce the corporate veil and sue the three of you, personally, for harassment, targeted discrimination, and willful violation of state energy statutes. My lawyer is already on retainer. I will drag you through civil court for the next 3 years. I will make this neighborhood the most legally toxic piece of real estate in Aurora, Colorado. You could have heard a pin drop in that clubhouse." Gary swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Helen looked like she was going to be physically sick. Brenda's mouth was hanging open, her eyes darting frantically between me and the massive legal packet sitting in front of her. You wouldn't," Brenda stammered, her authoritarian facade completely crumbling. "Try me," I smiled. A cold, empty smile. "You try to find me one more time, I promise you I will buy another 100 feet of steel cable. I will expand the rig. I will buy a dozen neon Speedos and string them up right outside your master bedroom window, Brenda. And I will leave them there until the sun literally bleaches the fabric to dust." I stood up straight, grabbed my messenger bag, and slung it over my shoulder. "So, here is my countermotion. You are going to unanimously vote to drop all pending fines against Lot 42. You are going to permanently close the file on my clothesline, and you are going to leave me alone. Do we have a deal?" Gary didn't even hesitate. He raised his hand faster than I had ever seen a human being move. I motioned to drop the fines and close the matter. "Seconded," Helen gasped immediately, not even looking at Brenda. "All in favor?" Gary asked. "Aye," Gary and Helen said in unison. Brenda just sat there. Her hands were shaking. She looked down at her wooden gavel, realizing just how utterly useless it was against a guy who actually knew how to read a state statute. She didn't say a word. She just stood up, her face pale, shoved her chair back, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised when, a week later, a notice was slipped into every mailbox in Whispering Pines, announcing that Brenda had formally resigned as HOA president, citing unforeseen personal stress. Gary took over, and the very first thing he did was disband the Architectural Aesthetics Committee. As for me, I left the rig up. Obviously. It cost me $800, I wasn't going to take it down. Every Saturday morning I crank that winch, listen to those beautiful, terrible marine pulleys squeal, and I hang up my laundry. Sometimes it's just my jeans. Sometimes, when it's particularly windy, I inflate the yellow tube man, just for old times' sake. So, what did we learn today? Sometimes to clean up your neighborhood, you've just got to air out your dirty laundry.